Hi, everyone, and welcome to what is going to be a fascinating presentation of some of the most iconic and storied homes in Los Angeles, as chronicled by renowned architectural historian and native Angelino author David Silverman. Thanks for attending our event, and just a little housekeeping before we begin the program. I'm Russ Diamond of Snyder Diamond, and a current and proud ICAA Southern California board member. I want to make you aware that our chapter has many upcoming online programs, and for details, please visit our website, www.classicist-socal.org. We also want to thank Sean Nelson Builders and Crestron Electronics, tonight's sponsors, and sponsors for all ICAA SoCal digital programs. This lecture is being recorded. There will be a brief, as Jennifer mentioned, there will be a brief question and answer period at the end of this presentation. And she will accumulate your written questions as the program's going on. And during or at the end, David will answer them. We are honored to have David Silverman as our guest this evening. As mentioned earlier, David grew up in Los Angeles, practiced entertainment law for 19 years before discovering his true passion. He has been featured in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Hollywood Reporter, and Architectural Digest. His company, LA House Histories, specializes in producing privately commissioned coffee table books for owners of historic residences. David has authored 10 books and counting. So it is my pleasure to now introduce David Silverman. Take it away, David.
Thanks, Russ. It's great to be here, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm going to share my screen, and we'll get started. These are photos of some of my work. On the left are two of my books, and in the center is what they look like inside. They're all designed by an incredible graphic designer. And at the bottom right is an example of one of the books I've done for a house where no one famous lived there. It was a charming 1920s house in Hancock Park, and I did a 20-page booklet for the owner that was a gift for his family. So when I work on houses, they don't have to be super historic, famous architect, famous owners. That helps and makes the book longer, but it's not a requirement. I also do linen clamshell boxes like the two at the top. Those were filled with vintage photos, architectural drawings, and architects' papers on the house. And at the bottom left is a leather portfolio that I did with vintage photos of a house. And I also work with real estate brokers, a real estate broker who is selling the house at the bottom in Hollywood, near the Hollywood Bowl, hired me to find some old material, photos of the house that they could use in their marketing. And I discovered this house in the Journal of Electricity in 1924. And the house was originally built as a demonstration of the wonders of electricity in houses at the time. And they gave tours to the public where thousands of people came to visit the house. And I also work with architects, interior designers, and landscape designers when they're working on an older home and want to see what it originally looked like, either the interior photographs, exterior photos, or the original architectural plans. People often ask me where I find all my material, and I look all over. One of my favorite sources are old magazines, old issues of Architectural Digest. When it started, it was just Southern California, so they are a terrific source. Old movie fan magazines are great, old newspapers. When I worked on Shirley Temple's house, I worked with some really enthusiastic fans of Shirley's who gave me some great photos of the house. And I always contact the relatives of people who lived in the house, or if they're alive, the people themselves who lived in the house, and they're often a source of terrific information. So this is Louis B. Mayer. He's on the left with Mickey Rooney, Judy Garland, and Shirley Temple. And he was the co-founder of MGM and the head of the studio for 27 years, from 1924 to 1951. And at the time, it was known as the greatest studio in Hollywood. So Shirley Temple will be talking about her house. Judy Garland went to dinner parties at one of the houses we'll be talking about. And after dinner, she would perform in the living room for the guests. That's Louis B. Mayer in the center with his two daughters, Irene and Edie, and his wife, Margaret. And Edie and Irene both got married in 1930, within 6 weeks apart of one another. And Edie married Bill Getz, and Louis B. Mayer, or rather Irene Mayer married David O. Selznick. So David O. Selznick was the producer of Gone with the Wind and Rebecca, among many others. Both of those won Best Picture Oscars back to back, and he's the only producer in history to ever receive Best Picture awards consecutively. That was 1939 and 1940. That's him with Vivien Leigh at the top for Gone with the Wind, and at the bottom with Alfred Hitchcock and Joan Fontaine for Rebecca. And Bill Getz is on the bottom in the 1953 photo. He founded the independent studio International Pictures in 1943, and that merged with Universal in 1944 to become Universal International. So Universal was known as Universal International until 1963, when Jewel Stein's MCA bought it, and they dropped the International. And he was involved with the creation of another studio as well, 20th Century Fox. He was one of the founders of a company called 20th Century Pictures, and then it bought Fox Films in 1935, and that's why it's known as 20th Century Fox. And in the right, when Bill was head of the studio, he's pictured here with some of the stars that were under contract with Universal International. On the right is Jimmy Stewart, who was, of course, in Hitchcock movies Rear Window and Vertigo. Right next to him is Rock Hudson. And then behind them is Ronald Reagan. We'll talk about him a little later. And then in the center at the last row is Tony Curtis, who was in Psycho for Universal and Hitchcock. So when Louis B. Mayer's daughters got married, his wedding gift to each of them was a new house. But it wasn't just the house, it was the land. It was the money to hire an architect and build the house, and also the money to furnish the house. And Edie bought a Wallace Neff house in Bel Air, or she hired Wallace Neff to build her house in Bel Air. And Irene bought this piece of land in Beverly Hills. And it was a 2.2 acre lot right across the street from Charlie Chaplin's house. That's the red marker there. And so you can orient yourself. The Beverly Hills Hotel is in the center of this 1924 photo. And they bought the lot in 1932 for $12,000. Here's a closer photo. So that's the lot in the center at the bottom. It was right across the street from the Virginia Robinson Gardens, which looks pretty much the same today, 6.5 acres. And the Charlie Chaplin house across the street. And Pickfair was right up the road on Summit Drive. And Pickfair in the 1920s was the center of Hollywood social activities. And we'll see that the Getz house was the center of Hollywood social activities from the 40s into the 60s. And the Spalding house right behind the Robinson house is still there. And Silsby Spalding was the first mayor of Beverly Hills. And the tale is that there's a tunnel in between the Spalding house and Pickfair, but it seems a little doubtful because you see how far that is. Here's the house that Irene and David built in 1934. The architect was Roland Coate, and it cost $75,000 to build the house. And I just finished a 250-page book about this house earlier this year. And it was so long because there were so many famous owners. The owners are listed at the top. Those are just the famous ones today. When Irene and David got divorced, Irene rented the house out to Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, who lived there separately. And then the Selznicks sold the house to Edward Doheny III, the son of the original Doheny. And then he sold it to Sammy Davis Jr., David Murdoch from Dole Foods, Ted Field of the Marshall Field family and a movie producer, and Ed McMahon. And that's David and Irene on the right with their two sons, Jeffrey and Danny. And I introduced Danny Selznick, who's in his 80s now, to the owners of the house. And he came to the house and toured us around talking about what it was like in the 1930s and 40s to grow up there. And it was just a tremendous experience. Here's the house under construction. They hired Florence Yock to do the landscaping, and they hired her later in the process. So she took a photo of the house and drew in these plants to place them, or drew in these trees. And the house looks essentially the same today. Here's what the house looked like. It's on the cover of a Florence Yock book. And that's Louis B. Mayer and his grandkids in the backyard. And David Selznick was so pleased with Florence Yock's work that he hired her to landscape the set of Tara in Gone with the Wind. She didn't do the whole picture. She just did Tara. So she traveled to Georgia to look at the native plants to see what plantations look like, and then figured out how to take California trees and recreate that look in Culver City, where the current Amazon lot is. And that's David O. Selznick standing with Louis B. Mayer signing Clark Gable's contract. Florence Yock also did the landscaping on the Jack Warner estate, which Jeff Bezos just bought for $165 million. And Irene Selznick wrote a terrific memoir in the 80s, and she talks about how Jack Warner and his new wife, shortly after they got married, they went over to the Selznick's house, which was just completed, and they were so thrilled with the Roland Coate design and the Florence Yock landscaping that they decided to hire Roland Coate and Florence to do their house. The house was originally Spanish, but Jack's second wife didn't like the design. So Roland Coate did this Georgian revival, remodel, and Florence did the landscaping. And the house is on 9.4 acres, and the house itself is almost 14,000 square feet. And one of the reasons why the house is so famous is it's the last great Hollywood mogul estate that has never been subdivided. So it's got its original acreage. And when David Geffen bought it in 1990, he paid $47 million. And Billy Haynes also did the interior of this house, and he did the next house that we'll see, the Getz house. The entrance to the house is on the top right, where that red arrow is. And you don't see it here, but there's actually additional land. They had a 9-hole pitch and putt golf course, and Harold Lloyd's house, Green Acres, had a 9-hole mini golf course as well. And Harold and Jack would combine their two courses when guests would come over, and they would play 18 holes. So here's Edie's house, Edie and Bill. This was the second house where they lived after the original house in Bel Air. They bought it in 1947, and they owned the house for 43 years. And I just finished a 350-page book about this house. It was originally built by a couple named Eugene and Wynhill Smith, in 1938. He was the heir to a Michigan manufacturing fortune. And I got in touch with his wife's daughter-in-law, and she sent me that bathroom towel in the center, which says Winwood. So that's what Windhill Smith called the house, Winwood. And she also sent me these amazing construction photos of the house, like the one above. And the photo in the bottom is from Architectural Digest in 1940, after the house was finished. And that's Ann Miller standing on the steps in the backyard. When she came to Hollywood, she was the famous tap dancer who was said to tap 500 taps a minute. She was 20, and she started dating Louis B. Mayer. That's them at the bottom at the Mocambo Club in Hollywood. And he warned her not to marry this guy, which she wound up marrying. And they were married less than a year. They bought the house as soon as they got married. But when they divorced, less than a year later, they sold the house to the Getzes. It was a Gordon Kaufman house. Gordon Kaufman did Greystone. And the house here is in 1948. They redid the outside, and you see pretty much that same view today at the bottom, where the asphalt has been replaced by the paving stones and grass. You used to be able to drive up under that portico. That's Edie's chauffeur-driven Rolls Royce. She never drove herself. And you can see that they took out the driveway, so you can't drive under there anymore. Here's Bill and Edie in the library with the Billy Haynes interiors. He was the legendary interior designer who defined the Hollywood Regency style. And he did a who's who of Hollywood moguls, homes, stars, business executives from the 1930s to the 70s. And he was originally a silent movie star at MGM until Louis B. Mayer one day gave him an ultimatum. And he said, either give up your boyfriend and marry a woman, or Louis B. Mayer would cancel his contract. And Billy Haynes chose to stay with his boyfriend. They lived together for the next 47 years. And he became a legendary interior designer. And he designed virtually every piece of furniture in the houses he did. His first phase, when he first started doing houses, there were a lot of antiques. But later in his career, and the Getz house is one of the first ones, he designed all of his own furniture. And there were only 2 pieces of furniture in the Getz house that were antiques. All the rest were custom designed by Haynes. This is the living room, which is just quintessential Haynes. You see the Gemütlich, which is German for cozy table, which was a Haynes signature, in the foreground, with the leather wrapping. That was the Haynes signature. The Sanaya chairs, or those big white sofa chairs, that's Sanaya is Haynes spelled backwards. The pastels, the low-slung furniture. And this was a classic, one of the most famous Hollywood screening rooms at the time. And most dinner parties would end with a movie, and Edie would sit at the back beneath those 3 paintings on the left, and she would use the telephone to call the projectionist in the projection booth, which was right behind here. And she would press a button, and that panel where the 3 paintings are would rise up, and you see the windows where the projection booth was. And on the opposite wall, the screen would come down. It was just a giant screen for that era. It was 20 feet across. And there were speakers encased in the 2 cabinets where the 2 lights are. And they had a custom fanfare composed by a Hollywood film composer play. And the living room looks pretty much the same today. So the photo in the upper right, is all these two 2017 photos are the listing photos when the house was staged. Here's another view of the living room with the low-slung Billy Haynes furniture. And Getz's were famous for their Impressionist art collection. So in the 50s, they were probably the most famous Hollywood couple with the biggest art collection. They had nearly 70 Impressionist works. And when Edie died in 1988, 28 works were auctioned by Christie's for $85 million, which set a record for a single owner's collection. That Ming table on the right in the foyer was one of the two pieces of furniture that Billy Haynes did not design. Here's more of their art. They had a Degas ballerina sculpture that all the guests would touch. They just couldn't help but touching the muslin skirt and the fabric ribbon in her hair. They had a famous Van Gogh that you see in the photo, and also below a self-portrait, which was disputed whether or not it was a Van Gogh. And the Picasso on the right was the highest selling work at the Christie's auction in 1988. That sold for $25 million. And that's Marilyn Monroe with the Degas and the Picasso. She came over to the house once for dinner in 1956 with the director of one of her movies, Bus Stop, and he took a bunch of photos of her posing with the art. Here's Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow at the house. They're posing in front of that Picasso and the table that we saw earlier. The Getzes were great friends with Sinatra. And in 1966, Frank was 50 and he married Mia, who was 21. And they got married at the Las Vegas Sands Hotel, where Frank performed often. They got married in a hotel room. Bill and Edie were the best man and matron of honor. And then they all flew back in Frank's private jet to Holmby Hills, where they had the wedding party. And I uncovered about 20 photos of the wedding party, like you see here. That's the living room in the same angle as you see in the photo at the bottom. And it's just a tremendous view of Hollywood in the 60s. They were only married for 13 months. They separated in 1967. Mia was filming Rosemary's Baby at the time, and Sinatra's lawyer served her with divorce papers on the set. And the smoking was huge in Hollywood at the time. And I had so many photos of the living room that I was able to count the cigarette holders in that room. And just in that room, there were 12 different cigarette holders. And there was so much smoking in the house that when Christie's auctioned the art, some of it had to be restored. And that blue Picasso had turned green. And that sold for $25 million. And today, which was a record at the time for the highest selling Picasso. So that was 1988. And today, the highest selling Picasso is $179 million. And that was in 2015 to a Qatari prime minister. Here's the living room again. That's Mia dancing with Frank. And if you look carefully in her hands, she's got a banana in one and a cigarette in the other. And on the right is Rosalind Russell meeting Prudence Farrow. Prudence was Mia's sister, or is Mia's sister. And she's the origin of the song, the Beatles song, Dear Prudence. So the story was that in 1969, Mia was so distraught from the divorce and the success of Rosemary's Baby that she went to India with her sister Prudence to learn transcendental meditation from a yogi. And a few weeks later, the Beatles joined them. And John, Paul, and George would want Prudence to come out and hang out with them. And she wanted to stay in her room and meditate. And so the Beatles wrote Dear Prudence after Prudence Farrow. And today, Prudence Farrow teaches transcendental meditation in Florida. Here's the same study where they were. And the room looks essentially the same today. It's probably my favorite room in the house. Billy Haynes did that wooden work with copper, which I think is just gorgeous. And it's actually a cabinet. So you'd open it up and that's where they had their record player and record collection. You see it in the top right. And that's another wedding party photo. That's Richard Attenborough with Mia sitting on his lap, and Dean Martin is behind them, and Dean's wife, Jeannie, with Frank and Frank's valet, George Jacobs. George wrote an incredible tell-all memoir about his life working for Sinatra. And actually, when he came to LA, he started as a waiter for the Getzes. The Getzes had 8 staff, including butlers, maids, a full-time chef. And he got his start by working as a waiter in Hollywood houses, and he worked for the Getzes. So the Getzes were legendary for their dinner parties, and just like Pickfair in the 1920s was the center of Hollywood life, Hollywood social life, the Getzes' house was the center of Hollywood social life for more than 20 years. And virtually every major actor, director, and producer would have dinner there at this table. This is all Billy Haynes. Haynes believed that candlelight was more flattering than a chandelier. So there was no chandelier in the room. The meals were always candlelit. The table would seat 22. And Edie would sit at the far left at the head of the table underneath that Degas painting, and Bill would sit across from her. Billy Haynes put up that short wall that looks like a scroll to hide those 2 doors into the kitchen. And the previous owner raised it. So that's what you see in the third photo on the right. And Edie kept hostess notebooks of all of her dinner parties. And they listed the guests that she invited, the food that was served. And when a movie was screened afterwards, she would write down the name of the movie as well. And I got these copies of the notebooks, and they're just an incredible picture into Hollywood and LA society from the 40s into the 80s. And the one on the right was a party for Irene Selznick, her sister, in 1948. And Edie's writing is a little hard to read, so I wrote in the names of the famous people. If you look at the bottom, Billy Haynes was there with his boyfriend, and Louis B. Mayer was also there, so that must have been awkward. And it's also fun to compare the food that they ate. So in 1948, you see on the bottom right, suckling pig, fried chicken, roast beef, spaghetti and meatballs, frankfurters. And on the left, in 1975 at the bottom, the menu is chicken cacciatore and roast beef with natural gravy. And if you look at the top on that one, this was a dinner party for Ronald Reagan with Nancy. And he had just left the governorship of California a few weeks earlier. And this was presumably a party to celebrate. And if you look at the people that were invited, it's just an amazing who's who at the time. Billy Wilder, Freddie De Cordova was the producer of The Tonight Show. And that's Robert Wagner with Natalie Wood, Gregory Peck, Irving Swifty Lazar, and Frank Sinatra's valet, George Jacobs, actually worked for Irving Lazar before he went to work for Frank. Dean Johnson was a Hollywood lawyer, Jack Lemmon. That's Norton Simon, who was married to Jennifer Jones, who was David O. Selznick's widow. And then the Bloomingdales, who lived down the street on Delphern. And you could just write a whole book on these notebooks. And then also at the bottom, you see that Fred Astaire was there along with Gene Kelly. I wrote an article about Edie and her entertaining in the Hollywood Reporter in February. And if you Google Edie Getz Hollywood Reporter, you'll find it, or you can email me, or we can post a link to it in the chat afterwards. Here's the kitchen, and it's an amazing look at a legendary Hollywood estate where they never changed the kitchen. And those are the plans from 1947 in the bottom right for the pantry. And the photo above is the view of this drawing. So if you look at the door with the circular glass window, you'll orient yourself. And it looks exactly the same today with the metal counter. On the far right was the refrigerator. And then next to that is the warmer. And on the left is the kitchen today. So now we go to Brentwood, to Shirley Temple's house. This was the first book I wrote that was about a famous Hollywood star. And she was born in Santa Monica on 24th Street in 1928. That's the house at the top. And then she moved to Brentwood in 1934. That's on 19th Street, right near the Brentwood Country Mart. The house is right below San Vicente. And the photo of her is from 1935. She was 7, and Bill Getz was at Fox when she was there. And from 1935 to 1938, she was the most popular movie star in the world. She would get 60,000 fan letters a month, and fans would gather outside of her house in Brentwood. There was no wall, and her parents were concerned about kidnapping because 3 years earlier, the Lindbergh baby was killed. And so the parents of Shirley start looking for a new house. That's Louis B. Mayer with Shirley on the right when she made 2 movies at MGM that were produced by David O. Selznick. And that's Selznick with Shirley at her Westlake graduation. She's probably the most famous graduate of Westlake. And this is where they bought. So this is 1927 view of Brentwood, Mandeville Canyon. And 8 years later, they bought the land that I put a box around in white. And it's right across from Paul Revere Junior High. So that was the Riviera Country Club's polo fields. And it was right off Sunset. And Bristol is pretty amazing. Today that it goes straight through, but in 1956, you see it used to be a circle. And in 1956, that's when the LA City straightened Sunset, and that circle was sold to developers, and they created 5 houses there. And the street that makes up the circle is today called Bristol Circle. So they hired John Byers to build the house in 1935. This is the back of the house. So Sunset's at the bottom, and the Riviera polo fields are right across from it. Rockingham is at the top. That is, of course, the famous O.J. Simpson Street. And she lived there until 1950. Here's the front of the house. It's the house on the left. And it was just an incredible playground for a child. When she was 12, in 1940, her parents built the playhouse that you see at the bottom, which was a full-size house. It was around 3,000 square feet. And then in the center, you see the pool and the pool house. She had a barn with 2 horses and a riding ring, and then the carousel. Here's the backyard. She had a roller coaster on the left that was the length of 2 tennis courts. That's the carousel in the center with Shirley standing wearing the shorts. And the barn is on the right. That's Shirley with her Cocker Spaniel, who's named Rowdy. And then a company that made glass bricks built this playhouse for her right near the pool that was made out of glass bricks. It was a birthday gift to Shirley, but they advertised it And so it became a promotion for their glass bricks. And then that's Shirley in the pool. This is the house from the front. It was 5,000 square feet, English Normandy, on 3 acres. Here's Shirley's bedroom. Shirley's family auctioned off a lot of her belongings, including scores of her dolls from her doll collection. And so fans today own the dolls that you can actually see in these old photos. There were so many photos of Shirley at the house. And so a lot of people can point out the items that they own from these old photos. And here's the house today. So on the left is the middle school, Rockingham's at the top. The original house is number 1 and 2. And the circle there is where the house was split in half. So in 1957, my guess is that the house was just too big to be sold. And so they cut it in half. And since then, it's been 2 separate houses. The playhouse is number 3. And they all share a beautiful stone wall. So if you're ever driving up Rockingham, look on the left for a giant stone wall, which goes the length of these 3 houses. And then 4 and 5 is where her barn and riding ring was. And those are newer houses. Here's our last house. We go back to Holmby Hills. This one was built in 1935. And Frank Sinatra bought it in 1948. That's Frank and Louis B. Mayer in 1946. He did the MGM movie Anchors Aweigh. It was a Spanish colonial house. And the 5th owner was the son of the couple on the left. That's Evelyn Walsh McLean and her husband, Ned. And he was the owner of the Washington Post. And she was famous for being the last private owner of the Hope Diamond. That's the Hope Diamond on the right. And that's Evelyn wearing it in 1911 when she bought it for $180,000. And it's now at the Smithsonian. And the last time it was appraised was supposed to be 2009. And apparently it was appraised for $250 million. And the story was that anyone who owns it will be cursed, and all sorts of terrible things happened to Evelyn and Ned. One of their sons died, and a daughter died as well. One of their remaining sons, Ned Jr., is on the right at his first marriage in 1938. He bought the house in 1947. With his second wife, who was Gloria Hattrick, and they divorced 9 months after they bought the house. She got it in the divorce, and she sold it in 1948 to Frank Sinatra. And then she had met Jimmy Stewart at the home of Gary Cooper, which was right next door to the Getz house. They got married in 1949. At the church in Beverly Hills on Little Santa Monica, or no, Big Santa Monica. And then they were together for the next 44 years. That's Gloria and Jimmy in 1991. That's Frank in the courtyard of the house. Here he is with his family in the living room. So they're sitting in the corner of that seating bench. That's Frank, his daughter Nancy. They called her Little Nancy, and his wife was Big Nancy because she was Nancy also. And then Tina was the youngest, and Frank Jr. was on the right. And that's his kids on the right, on the stairs going down to the pool. So Walt Disney lived across the street from the Sinatras, and the Sinatra kids who grew up at the house would walk across the street for rides on Disney's train. And Disney had this train from 1950 to 1953, which ran around his house. It was a half-mile long, and he called it the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad because the street where they lived was Carrollwood. And he stopped running it in 1953 when a young girl was burned by the steam. So it was actually a steam locomotive. It was 1/8 scale. And so he shut down the railroad, and also he was focusing on Disneyland, which opened in 1955. And the locomotive that you see in the big picture from the 50s was the model for the railroad at Disneyland. He called it the Lily Bell because his wife's name was Lillian. Here's a model from the Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, which is just a terrific museum. They have this full-scale model, and it was a ranch house you see at the back, and the train tracks went all around. They had a 90-foot tunnel, which you see in the photo above and in the model. And that red barn is today at Griffith Park. And it's now a museum, and you can see some of the trains and photos from the railroad. And there's great videos on YouTube that you can see of Disney operating the train that are very cool. If you go on YouTube and search for Carrollwood Pacific, you'll find them. 1 year after the Sinatras bought the house, Frank started having an affair with Ava Gardner, and he left Ava, or he left his wife to be with Ava and got married, and that caused a huge media uproar because he left his wife and kids, and he was with Ava until 1957. And Nancy and the kids stayed at the house until 1961. And she sold it to Charles and Flora Thornton. He was known as Tex. They owned it for 49 years, which is one of the longest periods of time that anyone has owned a house that I've written about. He was the co-founder of Litton Industries, which was a giant conglomerate defense contractor. They owned Royal Typewriters and Stouffer's Frozen Foods, Litton microwave ovens. And she was one of LA's great philanthropists. The USC School of Music is named after her. And then when she passed away, it was sold to Brad Gray and his wife, and he was the CEO of Paramount for 12 years. And he tore down the house and built this. And that sold in 2018. Here's an aerial photo of this area in 1985, and 35 years later, in 2020, the Sinatra house is at the bottom, and the Getz house is at the top. So you see the Disney house on the right. Disney lived next door to Clark Gable and Carole Lombard early on, and Barbra Streisand was in that house for 28 years. And on the right, you see the same view today. So the Sinatra house today, the Disney house, the Clark Gable and Streisand house were demolished for those mega houses, but the Getz house is still there. I just imagine all the stories that happened in these houses from the 1920s through today. So thank you to Snyder Diamond and the ICAA for inviting me to do this, and for all of you for watching. If you live in an older house, or if you know someone who does and you're curious about its history, don't hesitate to get in touch. So now we're going to open it up to questions. And if anyone wants to go back to a particular slide, I'd be happy to do that.
Thank you, David, so much. I also just wanted to let the group know I put in the chat the article from the Hollywood Reporter that you referenced. So that's now in the chat for everyone. Yeah.
Thanks, David. That was fascinating.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Such a colorful history we have here in LA, right?
Yeah, there's just so many connections between the people of this society and Hollywood, and that's one of the highlights of my books, is finding out all those connections and who knew who, and sharing the same architect or interior designer.
So when you're commissioned to do a book, is that a requirement? Do you have to have a home where a celebrity lived or a well-known architect?
No, the things that make the work I do better, so the book would be better, or I'll have more chance of finding photos, are really four things or so. So the older the house, the better. The more Hollywood residents, the better, because the Hollywood people had a lot of photos taken at the house. Back then, the stars would actually do publicity photos at their house, in their backyard or inside the house. So you get an amazing view with those kind of photos. And then if a famous architect did it, or an interior designer, and then the older the house, the better, and the more owners, the better. But none of those things are requirements. It just makes it more likely that I'll find things. But I'm able to often find photos or stories of houses where no one famous lived there.
Okay. We have a question from Lisa. She's saying that she thinks she went to a wedding at one of the Sinatra homes, and it's for rent now for events, and it has a small phone booth at the end of one of the halls. Does that sound familiar to you?
No, it's not this one, because this was demolished. But he lived in Beverly Hills, so his other Beverly Hills house was demolished also. So he lived in, I think, 3 or 4 LA houses, and then his Palm Springs house is still there. Right. But I'm not familiar with the phone story.
Yeah, I'd be curious the address of that, if we could kind of dig up some information on that. And then we have Scarlett asking what happened to the Hope Diamond. Did Sinatra buy it, or did it go straight to the Smithsonian after?
When she died, all of her jewelry went to Harry Winston. And Harry Winston sold a lot of it, and he bought the entire collection of jewelry for like $300,000. And then he donated the Hope Diamond to the Smithsonian. And I don't know why, maybe because it was cursed for tax purposes, who knows? But he didn't sell it, so he donated to the Smithsonian, and it's been on display there in the gem room since I think 1940s or 50s.
And we have Lauren King wants you to do a book on her house. She has the Fanny Bryce house on Faring around the corner from Getz. And so she's left her phone number, but maybe you can just give us your email or your website so that people can reach out to you.
Yeah, so let me, basically the website is lahousehistories.com, and my contact info is there. But I will bring up the screen really quickly. It's right here. Okay. So feel free to reach out, and I would love to help.
And Lauren, I've written down your phone number, so I'll make sure you two get connected. I'll
already emailed it, David. It's already done. It's all good. But
so
and I do all sorts of things, not just books. So the books can take 2 or 3 years, and it's a big undertaking, but often I can just find photos, and someone can hire me on an hourly basis. I can often find photos in a few hours, or I can do a gift for someone. So things vary depending on how much time I devote to it.
So given that, can you give us sort of a price range of what a book might cost?
Yeah, again, it depends on the time. So like that booklet I did for the Hancock Park house where no one famous lived, that took less than 10 hours, I think. And so that would be a few thousand. And the Getz book was 2 years worth. And that goes up to tens of thousands. So it really just depends on how much time. And that's the difficult thing, is I don't really know going in what
you're
I'll
gonna
find.
unearth.
Right. But the idea is that I realize that no one wants to just give a blank check. And so I try to work with my clients and be as reasonable as I can.
Sure. So do you have a favorite estate that you've researched and created a book out of so far?
I think the most recent one, the Getz house, it's my biggest, and there was so much on that house because so many Hollywood figures went there. So I was able to look at biographies of tons of stars from that period, and they would talk about it, or memoirs. People would everyone mentioned the Van Gogh and watching movies there and the incredible food. She was just a legendary hostess. And
that guest list was fascinating.
Wasn't that amazing? We can go back to that if anyone wants.
Yeah, let's have another look at that. And I think the selection and odd variety of food was very period, right? As we're going back to that, we have Genevieve is asking if we can send everyone a copy of the slideshow. I know we're recording this, and so we'll have this available. Is that probably the best way we can have people access it? Jennifer Whitmer?
Yeah, the recording will be the best way.
Okay.
It'll be on the blog next week. So if you want to check out Senator Diamond blog, then it'll be there. Or we'll have it on our YouTube channel or.
Yeah, so she had these notebooks. The one on the right is just a spiral notebook like you use in high school or college. And the one on the left, I cut off the page, but it was one of those small 3-ring binders. And it was just chronological. And she had multiple binders where she or her secretary would write in all this information.
Fascinating. And I used to be just a huge Shirley Temple fan when I was a little girl. And I know I read somewhere that she was born or grew up on 24th Street in Santa Monica. What's the closest cross street?
It's, I think, 2 or 3 blocks north of Wilshire. So it's right near that park, Wilshire and 26. What's it called? Douglas Park? I think it's called Douglas Park.
Yeah. I there all the time. I want to drive by.
It's right near there. Okay. And both those houses look exactly the same today.
I feel like I've seen it, but I haven't been consciously, trying to place it when I've driven by there, but I'm sure I have dozens of times.
No stalking, Jennifer.
Yeah. And I loved that you found 12 cigarette holders in that one photo. That's so gross.
Yeah, that was fun to count. And virtually every photo that I found, people are smoking, except for when they're posing. Yeah. Of
course. Yeah, and I just have to add, yesterday we kind of went through this just for the audience, and the image of the kitchen in the guest house that it's been untouched. First of all, fascinating that nobody has decided to update that kitchen, but Mr. Russ Diamond immediately rattled off the exact appliances from the 30s that were in there.
Okay, let me go back.
He knew the series as well. Don't forget.
Well, exactly. even in the newer kitchen too, those are some dated appliances as well. So
you knew exactly what it was.
So this is when the house was listed in 2017. It was bought in 2017, and so this isn't the way it looks today. Sure. But the previous owners kept the kitchen as is.
You have some old KitchenAid dishwashers in there and some LK sinks, and that's the back.
Yeah, I'm not sure if people can read. Oh, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, that's a multi-level range from Wolf Range. It's a commercial range actually in the back.
With the red handles?
Yeah, the red knobs.
Yeah. It's still a pretty kitchen.
Yeah, it's great light to have the windows on both sides.
It looks more like
I'm not sure if people can read, but underneath the door in the drawing at the bottom, it says Monel metal counter. And I didn't know what Monel was. And it was a famous brand of metal counters in the 1930s. Metal counters were big, and Monel was the brand that people used. So this is probably still Monel.
Okay, if we have any other questions, please get them out there. I think we're about to wrap this up.
There's a couple
Aurora
of
just made. Did I miss a couple?
Look in the Q&A. I see some.
Well, Aurora just made the comment that she'd always wondered where the name Prudence came from Dear Prudence. So that was a cool bit of trivia.
Yeah, if you go on YouTube and listen to the song and listen to the lyrics, and it totally makes sense with how she won't come out and play because she was practicing meditation.
Hey, Jennifer, there are questions in the Q&A also, not just the chat, but if you look at the Q&A, there's a few questions.
Yep. Okay, there we go.
See it? Yeah.
I got it. Okay, so this comes from Joel. Why wasn't there more of an historical preservation set up for any of these homes?
It all depends on the owner, whether they want to register it. So I think some of these are protected today. So a lot of them look the same outside today.
There is a pretty, I mean, I'm not an expert, but there is a pretty strong historical preservation presence here in LA. And I don't know about these homes in particular, but a lot of homes in this area are protected. Which is nice.
I think I forgot to mention in this photo, the on the right at the bottom. So that's in India with the yogi who actually invented transcendental meditation is in the back. And then in the front are the Beatles with their girlfriends or wives. And then Prudence, it's really small, but she's on the far left in the front.
Jennifer Hardy asks, are there any comparable houses today, the hub of Hollywood's social life? I would imagine we just aren't privy to that anymore.
Isn't the Kardashians?
I'm not privy. My guess is probably not, because I would guess that most people go out to dinner and they'll just go to a hot Hollywood restaurant rather than eating at home, even if they have a chef. And I think the style of entertaining then was much different. It was mostly at home, and you know, people would dress up wearing suits and ties and tuxes to the Getzes, and the women would wear beautiful dresses and gowns, and that's just not done today, unfortunately.
It's just a different way of socializing. And then we just have some comments thanking you, David. Michelle says, thank you so much. It was very interesting. Susan Besser says, I really enjoyed the presentation. And Lizzie Dinkle says, loved this presentation, so fascinated. Oh, and we have Joel is saying maybe Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell. Yeah, maybe, but still back probably in the 80s or 70s. Well, and actually didn't they mostly lived in Aspen or outside of Aspen for a long time.
Maybe an agent, because they want to entertain and meet a lot of people. So maybe some big agents.
Right.
I mean, we've been to Ron Ovitz's home, and that's pretty miraculous. And Gary Pastor was on, I don't know if he's still on, but he was the contractor. It took them 5 years to build that house, and there is some incredible art in that house. He's got Picasso's, and I forget the artist who did the entry, but it's a chalkboard, and it's just the same pattern over repeated for the whole hallway. It's really a remarkable home.
Wow.
A little contemporary. It's a little different in style, but kind of has some good bones to it.
Will there be any house tours in the future?
I would love to do that. That would be incredible. It's just a matter of getting the owners to consent.
Yeah.
I've been working with the Virginia Robinson Gardens, and they do an annual tour where their members, or the people who pay for the garden tours, get to visit these incredible houses. And actually, the Getz house was on the tour recently, and other houses that I've written about are on those tours. So it's easier to see the garden than the inside.
Mm-hmm.
But when a house is for sale, that's another good way to see inside.
That's your chance. Yeah.
So yeah, so for I would recommend anyone to look at the hot property section every Saturday and scout out open houses. And unfortunately, the really expensive historic houses don't have open houses, but sometimes they do.
Right. Well, this was fascinating. So much fun. Thank you so much for taking your time.
Thanks,
and doing
Jennifer
this for us.
and Russ. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun, and
Thank you so much,
This is
David.
my biggest audience yet.
Well, we hope
Take
to
care,
do it
everyone.
again. And just for everybody, thank you guys for checking in, and stay tuned. We have a lot more great content that we're working on that'll be coming up. So be on the lookout for those announcements as well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Take care, everybody.